What happens when unlimited wealth meets unshakable dignity? Tonight, you'll witness the moment a quiet single father did what an entire luxury hotel staff couldn't do: stand up to the most feared woman in the city. This is the story of Veronica Steele and Daniel Hayes, and how one evening changed everything. Stay with me until the end to see how respect triumphs over riches, and don't forget to comment which city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Part 1. The storm brewing. The crystal chandeliers of the Crestmont Hotel cast dancing shadows across marble floors that had witnessed 1,000 power plays, but none quite like what was about to unfold on this rain-soaked Tuesday evening. Outside, the storm hammered against floor-to-ceiling windows, while inside a different kind of tempest was brewing, one that would shake the very foundations of how the city's elite viewed power and respect. Veronica Steele's Bentley pulled up to the hotel's grand entrance at exactly 7:30 p.m., its sleek black exterior cutting through the sheets of rain like a knife through silk. The valet, Marcus, felt his stomach tighten as he recognized the license plate Steele 1. He'd been working the Crestmont's entrance for 15 years, had seen oil barons, tech moguls, and foreign dignitaries, but none of them made his hands shake quite like this woman. "Evening, Ms. Steele." Marcus managed his voice barely audible over the thunderclap that seemed to announce her arrival. Veronica emerged from the vehicle without acknowledging him, her 6-inch Louboutin heels clicking against the wet pavement with military precision. At 42, she commanded attention not through beauty, though her sharp features and steel-gray eyes certainly arrested the gaze, but through an aura of barely contained fury that seemed to radiate from her designer-clad frame. Her black Chanel suit was immaculate despite the weather. Her platinum blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her perpetual expression of disdain. The hotel's revolving door seemed to part before her like the Red Sea, and as she swept into the opulent lobby, conversations died mid-sentence. Guests who'd been laughing over champagne suddenly found their glasses fascinating. The concierge, normally the picture of composed hospitality, fumbled with his papers as those cold gray eyes swept across the space, cataloging every perceived inadequacy with the efficiency of a quality control inspector in hell. "Table for one," she announced to the maitre d', her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested the entire establishment existed solely for her convenience. "My usual table, and I trust the service will be adequate tonight." The word adequate dripped from her lips like poison, and Henri Dubois, the restaurant's seasoned maitre d', felt 20 years of experience crumble under her gaze. He'd served everyone from senators to Supreme Court justices, but Veronica Steele was in a category all her own, a category marked, "Danger, proceed with extreme caution." "Of course, Ms. Steele," Henri replied, his French accent thickening under stress. "Right this way, please." As they moved through the restaurant, whispers followed in their wake like smoke. Other diners recognized her from the financial pages, from the business news segments, where anchors spoke her name with a mixture of reverence and fear. Steele Industries had crushed competitors like paper cups, and Veronica herself was known to fire entire departments before lunch and acquire companies before dinner. She was corporate America's most feared predator, dressed in Chanel and armed with a smile that could freeze champagne. The usual table, a corner booth with a commanding view of the entire restaurant, awaited her. Henri pulled out her chair with practiced grace, but before he could speak, Veronica's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her expression, if possible, grew even more glacial. "Another company just folded," she said to no one in particular, her voice carrying enough to reach nearby tables. Apparently, they couldn't handle the pressure of competing with real business leaders. She looked up at Henri with those predatory eyes. "I'll need service that's equally decisive tonight." I have several more calls to make that will likely reshape the futures of a few thousand employees. Henri nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. We'll ensure everything meets your standards, Ms. Steele. See that you do, she replied, already turning her attention to her phone. The last time I was here, the service was so slow, I actually had to wait for my wine. Waiting is not something I do, Henri. I trust tonight will be different. The threat hung in the air like perfume, sweet and suffocating. Henri retreated toward the kitchen, his mind racing through the staff roster. Who could possibly handle the table from hell? Who among his team had the combination of skill, speed, and sheer nerve required to survive an encounter with Veronica Steele? In the kitchen, the news of her arrival spread like wildfire. Carlos, the head chef, immediately began barking orders with renewed intensity, knowing that any mistake would result in consequences that rippled far beyond a simple complaint. The kitchen staff moved with the urgency of surgeons, each dish prepared as if their livelihoods depended on it, which, given Veronica's reputation for destroying businesses that displeased her, might well be the case. "Who's taking table 7? Asked Sarah, one of the senior waitresses, her face already pale with dread. "Not me," replied James normally, the restaurant's most confident server. "Last time I served her, she had me fired from my previous job just for bringing her water with ice when she specifically requested no ice. She called my manager personally and told them I was incompetent and unemployable. She's blacklisted 3 servers just this year," added Maria, backing away from the order pad as if it were contaminated. "Remember what happened to Tom? He brought her the wine she ordered, but apparently it wasn't the vintage she was thinking of, even though she didn't specify. Next day, he couldn't get hired anywhere in the city. Word is, she has connections everywhere." Henri stood in the kitchen doorway, watching his normally confident staff transform into nervous shadows of themselves. These were professionals who'd served heads of state, celebrities, and captains of industry, but Veronica Steele was different. She wasn't just difficult. She was destructive. A woman who seemed to take pleasure in crushing the spirits of those she deemed beneath her, which was essentially everyone. "Someone has to take the table," Henri said, his voice carrying a note of desperation he rarely allowed himself to show. "She's already checking her watch, and if we don't get someone out there soon." The sentence hung unfinished because everyone knew what came next. Veronica Steele's displeasure wasn't just expressed in poor reviews or complaints to management. She had the power and connections to end careers, to make sure that anyone who crossed her found themselves unemployable, not just at the Crestmont, but anywhere in the city's service industry. She collected enemies like trophies and displayed their professional destruction with the pride of a big game hunter. "I'll double the tip for whoever takes it," Henri offered, but even that generous incentive failed to produce a volunteer. "Triple it," Sarah countered, "and maybe I'll consider it." Before Henri could respond, a quiet voice spoke from the prep station where the evening's newest temporary server was arranging dinner rolls with methodical precision. "I'll take it." Every head in the kitchen turned toward Daniel Hayes, who looked up from his work with the calm expression of a man who'd faced far worse things than an angry billionaire. At 34, Daniel had the kind of face that suggested he'd lived through experiences that aged the soul more than the skin. His brown eyes held depths that spoke of late nights spent worrying about mortgage payments and school supplies, of choosing between his own meals and his daughter's lunch money, of maintaining dignity in the face of circumstances that would break lesser men. "You sure about that, Danny?" Carlos asked, genuine concern in his voice. Daniel had only been working at the Crestmont for 3 weeks, picking up temporary shifts to supplement his day job at the auto parts store. He was quiet, efficient, and had quickly earned the respect of the kitchen staff with his work ethic and unflappable demeanor. "I need the money," Daniel replied simply, removing his apron and reaching for a clean service jacket. My daughter's got a field trip next week and the overtime pay will cover it. Henri studied the younger man's face, searching for any sign of bravado or false confidence that might crumble under Veronica's assault. Instead, he saw something far more valuable: necessity wrapped in dignity, the kind of quiet strength that came from having real responsibilities and no room for the luxury of fear. Daniel Henri said carefully, "This woman, she's not like other difficult customers. She has the power to make your life very complicated." Daniel paused in buttoning his jacket, his hands steady despite the weight of every eye in the kitchen. "Henri," he said quietly, "my life's already complicated. I'm a single father working 3 jobs to keep my daughter in a decent school and a safe neighborhood. I've been evicted twice, had my car repossessed, and still managed to show up to work with a smile. I think I can handle one angry rich lady who wants her dinner served properly." The simplicity of his response created a moment of profound silence in the usually bustling kitchen. Here was a man who understood real problems, real consequences, real fear, the kind that came from wondering if you could pay the electric bill, not whether someone might leave a bad Yelp review. Sarah whistled low under her breath. "You've got stones, Danny. I'll give you that." "I've got bills," Daniel corrected with a slight smile that transformed his serious face into something approaching boyish charm. "But thanks for the vote of confidence." As Daniel prepared to face Veronica Steele, his mind wandered briefly to his daughter Emma, who was currently at her friend's house working on a science project about ocean currents. At 8 years old, Emma had already learned not to ask for the expensive toys she saw in commercials, had learned to be grateful for the second-hand clothes from the church donation box, had learned to tell her friends that the reason they moved apartments so often was because her daddy liked exploring new neighborhoods. Emma believed her father was the strongest man in the world, and Daniel would walk through fire before letting her discover that sometimes even strong men felt overwhelmed by the weight of keeping promises to the people they loved most. Tonight's tips could mean the difference between Emma going on that field trip with her class or staying behind while her friends explored the science museum, another small disappointment in a young life that had already seen too many. "All right," Henri said, making his decision. "Daniel, you'll take table 7. But listen carefully. Be polite, be precise, and whatever you do, don't let her see any weakness. She can smell fear like a shark smells blood, and once she senses it, she'll circle until she finds a way to destroy you." Daniel nodded, straightening his tie with the same careful attention he brought to everything else in his life. "Understood. What does she usually order?" "That's the thing," James said with a bitter laugh. "She never orders the same thing twice, and whatever she orders, it's never good enough. The wine is too warm or too cold, the meat is overcooked or undercooked, the service is too slow or too rushed. She finds fault with perfection just to watch people scramble to fix problems that don't exist. Some people get their power from building things up," Maria added sadly. "She gets hers from tearing things down." Daniel absorbed this information with the same methodical calm he'd brought to learning every other aspect of his temporary position at the Crestmont. In his 3 weeks there, he'd memorized the menu, learned the wine list, and studied the preferences of regular customers with the dedication of a scholar. He approached each shift not as temporary work, but as an opportunity to excel because excellence was the only luxury he could afford to give freely. "One more thing," Henri added as Daniel prepared to leave the kitchen. "Whatever happens out there, remember that you're representing not just yourself, but everyone who's ever been made to feel small by someone with too much money and too little humanity. Show her that dignity doesn't have a price tag." Daniel nodded once more, then pushed through the swinging doors into the dining room, where his future, and Emma's field trip, waited at table 7. The storm outside seemed to intensify as he crossed the restaurant floor, each step taking him closer to a confrontation that would test everything he believed about respect, dignity, and the true measure of strength. Other servers watched from the corners of their eyes, some with sympathy, others with morbid curiosity, all wondering if they were about to witness another crushing defeat at the hands of the woman who'd turned cruelty into an art form. Veronica Steele sat at her corner table like a queen holding court in an empty kingdom, her fingers dancing across her phone screen with the practiced efficiency of someone orchestrating power plays from a distance. She'd already sent 3 emails that would result in layoffs, approved a hostile takeover that would leave a family business in ruins, and scheduled a meeting that would likely end with someone's resignation letter. It was by her standards a productive evening, and she was just getting started. As Daniel approached her table, she looked up with those cold, gray eyes that had stared down boardrooms full of Harvard MBAs and left them stammering like children. She took in his appearance with the calculating gaze of an appraiser, examining merchandise, noting the careful press of his uniform, the determined set of his shoulders, the way he moved with purpose rather than the nervous flutter she'd grown accustomed to inspiring in service staff. "Good evening, Ms. Steele," Daniel said, his voice carrying the kind of respectful authority that came from understanding the difference between servility and service. "I'm Daniel, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. I understand you have some important calls to make, so I'll ensure everything moves smoothly and efficiently." Veronica's eyebrows rose slightly at his directness. Most servers approached her table like supplicants approaching an altar, already apologizing for imagined infractions before she'd even spoken. This one, Daniel, spoke to her as if she were simply another customer deserving of professional attention rather than a predator requiring appeasement. "We'll see about that," she replied, her voice carrying the silky threat of a blade being drawn from its sheath. "I have very specific requirements, and I've found that most people in your position lack the competence to meet them. I hope you'll prove me wrong, though I must admit, past experience suggests otherwise." The insult was delivered with surgical precision, designed to establish dominance and create the kind of nervous energy that led to mistakes. Daniel absorbed it without flinching, his expression remaining pleasantly attentive, as if she'd commented on the weather rather than questioned his professional capabilities. "I understand completely," he replied. "Excellence is never too much to ask for, and you certainly deserve nothing less. What can I start you with this evening?" The response caught Veronica off guard. Where was the stammering, the defensive posture, the telltale signs of a spirit beginning to crack under pressure? Instead, she found herself looking into calm brown eyes that seemed to regard her not with fear or hostility, but with the kind of patient attention one might give to any customer worth serving well. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Veronica Steele felt the unfamiliar sensation of being seen not as a force of nature to be feared, but as a person to be respected. It was unsettling, in a way she couldn't quite define, like discovering that gravity worked differently in one specific corner of the universe. But unsettled or not, she was Veronica Steele, and she had a reputation to maintain. If this server thought he could handle her simply by being polite and professional, he was about to learn why she was known throughout the city as the woman who could break spirits with a glance and end careers with a whisper. The storm outside raged on, but inside the Crestmont Hotel, a different kind of weather system was forming, one that would test the very foundations of power respect and what it truly meant to be unbreakable in a world that seemed designed to crush anyone who dared to stand tall. Daniel stood beside table 7, order pad ready, completely unaware that he was about to become the eye of a hurricane that would change not only his own life but the way an entire restaurant, and perhaps an entire city, understood the difference between having power and earning respect. The battle lines were drawn, though only one side knew a war was about to begin. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire charged with the kind of tension that preceded either spectacular failure or unexpected triumph. Veronica's fingers drummed against the white tablecloth in a rhythm that had accompanied the downfall of countless business rivals, while Daniel waited with the patience of a man who had learned that rushing rarely led anywhere worth going. "I'll have the 1985 Chateau Margaux," she began, her voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to ordering items that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. "Make sure it's been properly decanted for exactly 45 minutes. Not 40, not 50. Pushmafu. The precurrent should be pressed à 65 degrees, and I want it served in Riedel Burgundy Grand Cru glasses, not whatever inferior stemware you typically use for your regular clientele." Daniel nodded, making careful notes without the frantic scribbling that usually accompanied orders at her table. "Of course. And for your meal this evening, the lobster thermidor, but I want the lobster from the tank that arrived this morning, not yesterday's inventory. The sauce should be prepared with Gruyere aged for a minimum of 18 months, and the cognac used in the preparation should be Hennessy Paradis, not whatever bottom-shelf liquor this establishment typically uses to cut costs." She paused, watching his face for signs of panic or confusion. "The temperature of the final dish should be hot enough to still be steaming when it reaches the table, but not so hot that it continues cooking the lobster. I assume you understand the difference between properly heated and overcooked." "Absolutely," Daniel replied, his pen moving steadily across the pad. The Chateau Margaux decanted for 45 minutes at 65 degrees in Riedel Burgundy. Grand Cru glasses and the lobster thermidor, prepared with this morning's lobster, 18-month Gruyere and Hennessy Paradis, served at the optimal temperature to maintain the lobster's texture. "Is there anything else you'd like to start with? Perhaps an appetizer while the wine is decanting." The competent recitation of her impossible order without a single stammer or request for clarification struck Veronica like a physical blow. She'd deliberately chosen items and specifications designed to overwhelm and intimidate to watch another server scramble to write down requirements they couldn't possibly fulfill correctly. Instead, she found herself looking at a man who treated her demands not as unreasonable impositions, but as a professional challenge worthy of his complete attention. "You think you can actually deliver all of that?" she asked, her tone sharpening like a blade being honed. "Because I should mention that the last server who took my order with such confidence ended up crying in the kitchen when he realized he'd promised something this establishment couldn't possibly provide. I had to explain to the management that incompetent staff reflects poorly on the entire operation." Daniel met her gaze directly, and for a moment something passed between them that had nothing to do with food service and everything to do with the recognition of strength meeting strength. "Ms. Steele," he said quietly, "I don't make promises I can't keep. It's a luxury I've never been able to afford. Your order will be exactly as you've requested, or I'll personally ensure it's corrected until it meets your standards." The simple declaration hung in the air like a challenge not to her authority, but to her expectations. Veronica found herself studying this unremarkable man who spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to stake his reputation on his word, because his word was all he had that couldn't be taken away. "We'll see," she said, finally returning her attention to her phone with the dismissive gesture that had ended 1,000 conversations. "I have calls to make while I wait. See that I'm not disturbed unless it's to deliver exactly what I've ordered." Daniel nodded and retreated toward the kitchen, leaving Veronica alone with her phone and the unfamiliar sensation of having been taken seriously rather than feared. She tried to focus on the email from her legal team about the Carson Industries acquisition, but found her thoughts drifting back to the server's steady brown eyes and the way he'd listened to her impossible demands as if they were reasonable requests from a valued customer. In the kitchen, Daniel's arrival created a stir that rippled through the entire staff like a stone dropped in still water. Henri rushed over, his face creased with concern and morbid curiosity about what fresh hell Veronica Steele had devised for her latest victim. "How bad?" Henri asked, already reaching for the aspirin he kept in his jacket pocket for emergencies exactly like this one. "She wants the 1985 Chateau Margaux decanted for exactly 45 minutes at 65 degrees, served in Riedel Burgundy Grand Cru glasses." Daniel began consulting his notes with the same methodical calm he'd shown at the table. "Lobster Thermidor, with this morning's lobster 18-month Gruyere Hennessy Paradis in the sauce preparation, served hot but not overcooked." The kitchen fell silent, except for the usual sounds of food preparation, but even those seemed muted as the staff processed the impossibility of what they'd just heard. Sarah was the first to break the silence with a low whistle that carried all the sympathy of a mourner at a funeral. "Jesus, Danny," she breathed. "She's trying to get you fired on your first night serving her. Half of those things aren't even on our menu, and the other half would cost more than most people make in a week." "Actually," Daniel said, still consulting his notes, "I think we can do this. I checked the wine cellar last week during my orientation, and I remember seeing a 1985 Margaux. It'll need to be decanted immediately to hit the 45-minute mark. Carlos, do we have the Gruyere aging specifications in the cheese inventory?" Carlos, who had been listening with the expression of a malpus watching a train wreck in slow motion, blinked in surprise. "You're serious? You actually think we can pull this off?" "I know we can," Daniel replied with quiet conviction. "But it's going to require everyone working together and doing their absolute best. This isn't just about one difficult customer anymore. This is about proving that we're professionals who can rise to any challenge." Henri stared at the young man who had just transformed an impossible situation into a rallying cry for excellence. In 30 years in the hospitality industry, he'd seen servers crack under far less pressure, but here was someone treating Veronica Steele's demands not as an attack to be survived, but as a standard to be met. "The wine," Henri said, suddenly snapping into action. "Marcus, get to the cellar and find that Margaux. Handle it like it's made of glass and gold, because that's essentially what it is. Sarah, call the sommelier and tell him we need the Riedel Burgundy Grand Cru glasses from the special occasion service. James, check the lobster tank and identify this morning's arrivals." The kitchen exploded into coordinated chaos as the entire staff threw themselves into the challenge with renewed energy. Daniel's calm confidence had transformed what should have been a recipe for disaster into something approaching a military operation, each person playing their part in a complex orchestration designed to meet the impossible standards of the woman who had made a career of crushing those who disappointed her. Meanwhile, at table 7, Veronica was discovering that concentrating on business was more difficult than usual. She'd ended 3 phone calls already, unable to focus on the familiar rhythms of corporate manipulation, while her mind kept returning to the server who had looked her in the eye and promised to deliver exactly what she'd demanded. It was unsettling in a way she couldn't quite identify, like discovering that a law of physics she'd relied on her entire life had suddenly stopped working. "Veronica, are you listening?" The sharp voice of her attorney, Richard Blackwood, cut through her distraction like a scalpel. "The Carson deal is at a critical juncture, and we need your decision on the pension fund liquidation." "Of course I'm listening, Richard," she replied, though her eyes were tracking Daniel's movement through the restaurant as he coordinated with the sommelier and kitchen staff. "Liquidate the pension fund. The employees should have planned better for their retirement, instead of relying on company benefits they never earned. It was the kind of ruthless decision that had built her empire, the sort of calculated cruelty that had made her the most feared woman in corporate America. But even as she spoke the words, she found herself wondering what the server with the steady eyes would think of a woman who could destroy the retirement security of hundreds of families with the same casual tone most people use to order coffee. The thought annoyed her precisely because it was so unusual. Veronica Steele had not built a billion-dollar empire by concerning herself with the opinions of service workers, and she certainly hadn't become the queen of hostile takeovers by developing a conscience about the collateral damage of her business decisions. Yet here she was distracted by a man whose entire annual salary probably equaled what she spent on shoes in a month. There's also the matter of the Henderson manufacturing acquisition. Richard continued, his voice carrying the kind of excitement that lawyers felt when they smelled blood in the water. We can force them into bankruptcy by the end of the month if we accelerate the debt recall. It'll put about 3,000 people out of work, but it'll clear the way for our automation project. Do it, Veronica said automatically, but her attention was drawn to the kitchen doors, where Daniel had just emerged, carrying a silver tray with practiced grace. Even from across the restaurant, she could see the care with which he balanced the expensive wine glasses, the precision of his movements as he approached her table. "Your wine, Ms. Steele," Daniel said, as he reached her table, setting down the tray, with movements that belonged in a ballet more than a restaurant. The 1985 Chateau Margaux decanted for exactly 45 minutes and served at 65 degrees in Riedel Burgundy Grand Cru glasses. Veronica ended her call without explanation, her full attention focused on the server who had just accomplished what she'd believed impossible. The wine gleamed in the crystal like liquid rubies, and when she lifted the glass to her lips, the temperature was perfect, the flavor exactly as it should be after proper decanting. "Acceptable," she said finally, the word carrying more weight than any praise she'd offered in recent memory. For Veronica Steele, acceptable was the equivalent of a standing ovation from anyone else. "I'm glad it meets your standards," Daniel replied. "Your lobster thermidor will be ready shortly. Chef Carlos is personally overseeing the preparation to ensure it's exactly as you requested." "You actually found 18-month Gruyere?" she asked, genuine curiosity creeping into her voice despite her best efforts to maintain her usual icy detachment. "We did. Aged in the caves of Gruyere, Switzerland, with the proper crystalline texture and nutty complexity you'd expect from authentic cheesemaking. The Hennessy Paradis is being incorporated into the sauce at precisely the right moment to enhance the cognac notes without overpowering the lobster's natural sweetness." The detailed explanation revealed a level of knowledge that went far beyond what she'd expected from someone she'd dismissed as merely another struggling server. Veronica found herself looking at Daniel with new interest, seeing not just competence but a genuine understanding of the craft behind fine dining. "You seem to know quite a bit about haute cuisine for someone working in this capacity," she observed the comment carrying just enough edge to cut without drawing blood. "Knowledge doesn't require wealth, Ms. Steele," Daniel replied evenly. "I've always believed that if you're going to do something, you should understand it well enough to do it right. Whether that's serving dinner or raising a daughter, half-hearted efforts don't produce worthwhile results." The mention of his daughter was casual, unguarded, the kind of personal detail that most people in his position would have kept carefully hidden from someone with her reputation for exploiting weakness. Yet Daniel had offered it naturally, as if being a father was something to be proud of, rather than a vulnerability to be protected. "A daughter?" Veronica found herself asking, though she immediately wondered why she cared about the personal life of her server. "Emma. She's 8. Daniel said, and his entire demeanor shifted subtly, the professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the warmth beneath. She's working on a science project about ocean currents tonight. Very serious about understanding how water moves around the planet. I think she's going to be smarter than her old man before she turns 10. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, the kind of pure, uncomplicated love that Veronica hadn't heard in so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. In her world, children were strategic considerations, inheritance planning concerns, or photo opportunities for family-friendly corporate imaging. The idea of someone working multiple jobs just to ensure their child could go on a school field trip was so foreign to her experience that it might as well have been science fiction. And this job helps you provide for her. The question emerged before she could stop it, propelled by a curiosity she didn't entirely understand. Every job helps, Daniel replied simply. I work days at an auto parts store, evenings here, when Henri needs extra help, and weekends doing landscaping. Emma thinks I just really like variety in my work. I prefer she sees it that way, rather than understanding that her father is one missed paycheck away from not being able to keep her in her school. The honest admission hung between them, like a bridge across an impossible chasm connecting two people whose lives existed in completely different universes. Veronica, who could buy and sell companies on a whim, found herself staring at a man for whom a single night's tips could mean the difference between his daughter's happiness and disappointment. That seems challenging, she said, finally, the word inadequate to describe what she was thinking, but the only one she could find that didn't reveal too much of her own confusion. It is, Daniel agreed. But it's also simple. Emma needs certain things to have the kind of childhood she deserves, and I'm the only one who can provide them. So I do whatever it takes to make sure she gets them. It's not complicated, just persistent. Before Veronica could respond, her phone buzzed with another call from Richard. She glanced at the screen, then at Daniel, then made a decision that surprised her as much as it would have surprised anyone who knew her reputation. I'll need to take this call, she said, but I don't want to be disturbed until my food arrives. Can you ensure that happens? Of course, Daniel replied, already moving to give her privacy, while positioning himself where he could intercept any other staff who might approach the table. As Veronica answered the call, she found herself watching Daniel in her peripheral vision, noting the way he managed his section, with quiet efficiency, the respect he showed to both customers and fellow staff, the complete absence of the desperate servility she'd grown accustomed to inspiring. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she was curious about someone rather than simply calculating how they might be useful to her. The conversation with Richard blurred past her attention as she observed Daniel helping an elderly couple with their dessert selection, his patience evident as they changed their minds twice before settling on something that clearly delighted them. She watched him coordinate with the busboy to ensure water glasses stayed filled, saw him notice when a child at another table dropped her napkin, and quietly provide a replacement without making the little girl feel embarrassed about the accident. These were small kindnesses, the sort of attention to detail that had nothing to do with tips or advancement, and everything to do with character. In Veronica's world, such behavior would be dismissed as weakness, inefficiency, a waste of time and energy that could be better spent on more profitable pursuits. Yet watching Daniel work, she began to wonder if perhaps her world had been missing something essential. Something that couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports or stock prices. When the kitchen doors swung open and Carlos himself emerged carrying her lobster thermidor, Veronica felt an unexpected flutter of anticipation. Not for the food, though she was genuinely hungry, but for the moment when Daniel would return to her table and she could continue their unlikely conversation. The lobster was perfect. The sauce carried exactly the right balance of cognac and aged cheese. The lobster itself was tender without being overcooked, and the presentation was worthy of a five-star establishment. But what struck her most was not the culinary achievement, but the fact that a kitchen full of professionals had rallied around one server's commitment to excellence, had worked together to meet an impossible standard because someone had believed it was possible. "How is everything?" Daniel asked as he returned to check on her meal, his voice carrying genuine interest rather than routine politeness. "Perfect," Veronica replied, and for the first time in years, she meant it without reservation. Absolutely perfect. The smile that crossed Daniel's face was like sunrise after a long night, transforming his serious features into something approaching joy. "I'm so glad. Sometimes the impossible just needs the right team and enough determination." "Is that your philosophy about everything?" she asked, genuinely curious about how someone facing such obvious financial challenges could maintain such optimism. "Pretty much," Daniel admitted. "I figure life's going to throw challenges at you whether you're ready or not. You can either let them defeat you or you can find a way to turn them into opportunities to prove what you're really made of. Emma's taught me that being knocked down isn't the same as being knocked out, as long as you remember what you're fighting for." The simple wisdom struck Veronica with unexpected force. Here was a man who faced real adversity daily, yet spoke about challenges as opportunities rather than obstacles. In her world, problems were things to be eliminated, competitors were threats to be destroyed, and obstacles were impediments to be bulldozed. The idea of embracing difficulty as a chance to demonstrate character was as foreign to her as speaking Mandarin. As the evening progressed and other customers came and went, Veronica found herself extending her stay far beyond her usual efficient dining schedule. She ordered dessert, something she rarely did, then lingered over coffee, something she never did. Each interaction with Daniel revealed new layers to a man she'd initially dismissed as simply another expendable service worker. She learned that he'd been married to his college sweetheart, who died in a car accident when Emma was 3, that he'd been completing a business degree when tragedy forced him to drop out and focus on immediate survival rather than long-term planning, that he'd never missed one of Emma's school events, even when it meant losing pay from other jobs, that he read business books from the library during his breaks, still harboring dreams of someday building something meaningful even as he struggled to maintain their basic needs. With each revelation, Veronica felt something shifting inside her chest, a sensation she couldn't quite identify, but that left her feeling oddly off balance. This was not how her evenings typically went. She was accustomed to dining alone, conducting business, making decisions that affected thousands of lives without ever considering the human faces behind the numbers. She was not accustomed to caring about the dreams of a single father who worked 3 jobs to afford his daughter's field trip. Yet here she was, lingering over coffee she didn't want, while listening to stories about a life so different from her own that it might as well have existed on another planet. And for the first time in years, she found herself questioning not just her evening plans, but the entire structure of assumptions upon which she'd built her empire. The storm outside began to subside as the evening wore on. But inside the Crestmont Hotel, something far more significant was taking shape. 2 people from completely different worlds had discovered that respect was not something that could be bought or sold, that dignity was not determined by bank account balances, and that sometimes the most powerful person in the room was not the one with the most money, but the one with the most character. As Daniel refilled her coffee cup for the 3rd time, Veronica realized she was about to face a choice that would reveal more about her true nature than any corporate acquisition or hostile takeover ever could. The question was not whether she had the power to change this man's life, but whether she had the courage to let him change hers. The 3rd coffee cup sat cooling between them as the restaurant gradually emptied around their isolated bubble of conversation. Other diners had long since departed, leaving behind only the soft murmur of closing duties and the distant clatter of dishes being cleaned in the kitchen. Veronica should have left hours ago, should have been in her penthouse reviewing acquisition reports and planning tomorrow's corporate warfare. Instead, she found herself anchored to table 7 by a fascination she couldn't name and didn't entirely trust. "Tell me about this business degree," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "What were you studying before your circumstances changed?" Daniel's hand paused momentarily on his coffee cup, and she saw something flicker across his features, not pain exactly, but the careful guardedness of someone who had learned not to dwell on paths not taken. "Strategic management with a focus on sustainable business practices," he replied after a moment. "I was particularly interested in how companies could build long-term value while maintaining ethical standards and supporting their communities." The irony was not lost on either of them. Here was a man who had dreamed of building businesses that lifted up communities, speaking to a woman who had built her empire by systematically dismantling them. Veronica felt an unfamiliar sensation in her chest, something that might have been shame if she'd been willing to acknowledge such weakness. "Sustainable business practices," she repeated, and there was something almost mocking in her tone, though whether she was mocking him or herself remained unclear. "That's an interesting concept. In my experience, sustainability and profitability rarely align. One usually has to be sacrificed for the other." "I disagree," Daniel said quietly, and the simple contradiction carried more weight than a shouted argument. "I think that's just what we tell ourselves to justify taking shortcuts that seem profitable in the short term, but ultimately cost more than they save. When you destroy the communities your businesses operate in, when you treat employees as disposable resources instead of valuable assets, when you prioritize quarterly profits over generational sustainability, you're not building something that lasts. You're just mining value until there's nothing left to extract." The words hung in the air between them like an indictment, and Veronica felt her defensive instincts rising like a tide. This was exactly the kind of naive idealism she'd spent her career crushing, the sort of soft thinking that led to corporate weakness and competitive disadvantage. She should have been offended, should have put this presumptuous server in his place with the kind of verbal precision that had left board members speechless and competitors retreating. Instead, she found herself genuinely considering his perspective for the first time in years. "And you believe that approach can compete in today's market? That being ethical doesn't automatically put you at a disadvantage against competitors who are willing to be more ruthless?" "I think it depends on how you define winning," Daniel replied, refilling her cup with the same careful attention he'd shown all evening. "If winning means accumulating the most money in the shortest time regardless of the consequences, then yes, ruthlessness probably has an advantage. But if winning means building something meaningful that improves lives and creates genuine value that lasts beyond the next quarterly report, then I think ethical approaches actually have significant advantages that most people don't see because they're not looking for them." Veronica studied his face, searching for signs of the naive romanticism she expected to find behind such idealistic statements. Instead, she saw the same steady intelligence that had characterized their entire interaction, the same thoughtful consideration that had allowed him to deliver impossible service standards while maintaining his dignity under pressure. "Explain," she said, settling back in her chair with the posture of someone prepared to listen to a presentation. It was a gesture that would have flattered most people, but Daniel seemed more focused on his thoughts than on the attention being paid to them. "Well," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about these concepts. "Consider employee turnover. Most companies treat high turnover as an acceptable cost of doing business. but they're not accounting for all the hidden expenses. Every time you lose an experienced employee, you lose institutional knowledge, relationships with customers, understanding of systems and processes that can't be easily replaced. The cost of recruiting, hiring, and training replacements, plus the productivity loss during transitions, usually far exceeds the cost of creating conditions that make good employees want to stay. Veronica nodded slowly, recognizing the validity of the argument, even as it challenged assumptions she'd held for decades. But retaining employees means higher compensation costs, better benefits, more expensive working conditions. In the short term, yes, Daniel agreed. But employees who feel valued and secure tend to be more productive, more creative, more willing to go above and beyond for customers. They become ambassadors for your brand instead of just people collecting paychecks. They solve problems instead of just following procedures. When you invest in people, they invest back in ways that show up in customer satisfaction, innovation, quality improvements, all things that drive sustainable profitability. The conversation was unlike any Veronica had experienced in years. In her world, discussions about business strategy were usually elaborate games of positioning and manipulation, each participant carefully guarding their true thoughts while probing for advantages. Here she found herself engaged in genuine intellectual exchange with someone who had no agenda beyond exploring ideas honestly. "And communities?" she asked, surprised by her own curiosity. "You mentioned supporting communities. How does that translate to competitive advantage?" Daniel's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for discussing beloved hobbies. Companies that genuinely support their communities create loyalty that money can't buy. When local businesses thrive, when people have good jobs that pay well enough to support families, when companies contribute to schools and infrastructure and quality of life, they create markets for their own products and services. They build economic ecosystems that generate sustainable demand rather than extracting value until the ecosystem collapses. "But that's essentially philanthropy," Veronica objected, though her tone carried more curiosity than dismissal. "You're describing companies spending money on things that don't directly generate returns." "I'm describing companies investing in things that generate returns over longer time horizons," Daniel corrected gently. "The problem is that most business models are optimized for quarterly thinking instead of generational thinking. When you measure success in 3-month increments, community investment looks like charity. When you measure success in decades, community investment looks like the foundation of sustainable competitive advantage." The insight struck Veronica with unexpected force. Her entire career had been built on quarterly performance, on delivering immediate results that impressed shareholders and analysts. The idea of optimizing for decades rather than quarters was so foreign to her experience that it felt like considering business strategy in an entirely different language. "You're talking about a fundamentally different approach to measuring success," she said slowly, her strategic mind beginning to see the implications of what he was suggesting. "Exactly," Daniel replied, his enthusiasm growing as he recognized her genuine engagement with the concepts. Instead of asking, "How much profit can we extract this quarter?" you ask, "How much value can we create that will still be generating returns 20 years from now?" Instead of, "How can we minimize labor costs?" you ask, "How can we develop human capital that becomes more valuable over time?" Instead of, "How can we dominate our competition?" you ask, "How can we expand the market in ways that benefit everyone?" Veronica found herself leaning forward, despite herself drawn into a vision of business that was simultaneously idealistic and pragmatic. "And you believe this approach can actually compete against traditional models?" "I think traditional models are becoming less sustainable every year," Daniel said thoughtfully. "Consumers are increasingly conscious about the companies they support. Employees, especially younger ones, are prioritizing meaningful work over just high compensation. Communities are becoming more selective about which businesses they want to attract and support. The companies that figure out how to align profit with purpose are going to have significant advantages as these trends accelerate. The analysis was sophisticated, nuanced, and completely at odds with everything Veronica had believed about competitive strategy. Yet coming from someone who worked 3 jobs to support his daughter's education, who had delivered impossible service standards through pure determination, who faced real adversity with philosophical optimism, the ideas carried a weight that academic theories never could. "You're describing a completely different paradigm," she said finally. "One that requires thinking in much longer time frames and accepting much more uncertainty about immediate returns." "That's true," Daniel acknowledged. "But I think the current paradigm is actually much riskier than it appears. When you build a business by extracting maximum value from employees, customers, and communities, you're essentially mining your own foundation. Eventually, you run out of value to extract, and the whole structure collapses. Sustainable approaches might grow more slowly, but they create businesses that get stronger over time instead of depleting their own resources." As they talked, Veronica began to notice things about Daniel that went beyond his words. The way he listened with complete attention, never interrupting or preparing rebuttals while she spoke. The way he considered her questions seriously, even when they challenged his positions. The way he maintained respect for her perspective while clearly articulating his own, never becoming defensive or dismissive, even when their views conflicted sharply. These were leadership qualities she rarely encountered in boardrooms full of Harvard MBAs and management consultants. Most of her business interactions were characterized by ego management, political maneuvering, and careful positioning for advantage. Here was someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding truth rather than winning arguments, who treated intellectual disagreement as an opportunity for learning rather than a threat to be defeated. "Can I ask you something?" Veronica said, her voice carrying a vulnerability she hadn't intended to reveal. "If you had the resources to implement these ideas to build the kind of company you're describing, what would it look like?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful as he considered not just the question, but the motivation behind it. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful precision of someone describing a vision he'd spent years refining. "I'd start with something small enough to really understand," he said. "Maybe a local business that served a specific community need, could be manufacturing, could be services, could be retail. The key would be to build every decision around the question of how to create genuine value for all stakeholders, employees, customers, community, environment, and yes, investors too, but not at the expense of everyone else." Specifically, Veronica pressed her strategic mind, engaging with the puzzle of translating idealistic principles into practical operations. "Well, let's say it was a manufacturing business." Daniel continued, warming to the topic. "Instead of minimizing labor costs, I'd focus on developing skills and capabilities that made our workforce genuinely more valuable over time. Instead of competing solely on price, I'd compete on quality, innovation, and reliability. Instead of extracting maximum value from supplier relationships, I'd build partnerships that helped suppliers grow and improve, creating a network of businesses that all benefited from each other's success." "That sounds expensive," Veronica observed, though her tone was analytical rather than dismissive. "In the first few years, absolutely," Daniel agreed. "But consider the long-term effects. Lower turnover means lower recruitment and training costs. Higher quality means fewer defects returns and customer service issues. Stronger supplier relationships mean more reliable supply chains and better prices based on volume and loyalty rather than just negotiating pressure. More skilled employees mean more innovation, better problem solving, higher productivity. And the community investment aspect. Supporting local schools produces better educated future employees. Contributing to infrastructure improvements reduces logistics costs and attracts other quality businesses to the area. Paying wages that support families creates customers for local businesses, including potentially your own. It's not charity, it's investing in the economic ecosystem that your business depends on. Veronica found herself mentally stress testing the model, looking for weaknesses and vulnerabilities with the same analytical rigor she applied to potential acquisitions. What about competitive pressure? If your competitors are willing to cut corners, you won't cut. How do you maintain market position? That's where the long-term thinking becomes crucial, Daniel replied. In the short term, yes, you might be at a cost disadvantage. But if you're building genuine competitive advantages, better products, more loyal customers, more capable employees, stronger community support, those advantages compound over time. Eventually, competitors who are mining their own foundations start facing the consequences: quality problems, turnover issues, community resistance, employee disengagement. The companies that invested in sustainable practices start pulling ahead, not despite their higher initial costs, but because of the capabilities those investments created. The conversation had evolved from casual discussion to something approaching a business school case study, but with the added weight of real experience behind the theoretical frameworks. Veronica realized she was engaging with ideas more seriously than she had in years, not because they were being presented by consultants seeking her approval, but because they were being explored by someone who had no agenda beyond understanding how business could be done better. "You've really thought this through," she said, and there was genuine respect in her voice. "I've had a lot of time to think," Daniel replied with a slight smile. "Late nights after Emma goes to sleep, breaks between jobs, quiet moments, when I'm not actively solving immediate problems. When you can't afford business school, you make do with library books and a lot of reflection on what you've observed working for other people." The reminder of his circumstances brought Veronica back to the immediate reality of their situation. Here was someone with sophisticated ideas about business strategy, clear leadership capabilities, and genuine wisdom about creating value, who was working 3 jobs to afford his daughter's field trip. The waste of human potential struck her as not just unfortunate, but genuinely tragic. "Daniel," she said carefully, "what would it take for you to finish your degree?" The question seemed to catch him off guard, and she saw something flicker across his features, hope perhaps followed quickly by the kind of protective skepticism that comes from having dreams disappointed too many times. "That's not really practical right now," he said finally. "Between work schedules and Emma's needs, I don't have the time for classes. And even if I did, I couldn't afford the tuition without taking on debt that would make our financial situation even more precarious. But if those obstacles weren't factors, if you had the time and resources..." Daniel was quiet for a moment, and Veronica could see him struggling with the temptation to engage with a possibility that seemed too remote to consider seriously. "I suppose I'd want to focus on sustainable business development," he said slowly. "Maybe add some coursework in community economic development, environmental systems, stakeholder theory. The goal would be to understand how to build businesses that genuinely strengthen the communities they operate in. And after graduation, what would you want to do with that knowledge?" Now Daniel smiled, and for the first time that evening, Veronica saw him allow himself to fully embrace a vision that went beyond immediate survival. "I'd want to start something. Nothing massive initially, but something that could demonstrate that the principles we've been discussing actually work in practice. something that could serve as a model for other entrepreneurs who want to build businesses that create value for everyone, not just shareholders. The passion in his voice was unmistakable, and Veronica found herself confronted with a choice that would define not just his future, but her own understanding of what power was meant to accomplish. She had the resources to make his dream possible with less effort than it took her to decide which wine to serve at a dinner party. The question was whether she had the wisdom to recognize an opportunity to create something meaningful rather than simply acquire something profitable. "What if," she said slowly, the words emerging before she'd fully processed their implications, "what if those obstacles could be removed?" Daniel looked at her with the careful attention of someone who had learned to be wary of offers that seemed too good to be true. "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting." Veronica wasn't entirely sure either. The evening had taken her so far from her usual patterns of thought and behavior that she felt like she was navigating uncharted territory without a map. But something about this conversation about this man and his quiet dignity and thoughtful vision had awakened possibilities she hadn't considered in years. "I'm suggesting," she said carefully, "that perhaps this conversation doesn't have to end with you returning to 3 jobs and deferred dreams while I return to quarterly reports and hostile takeovers. Perhaps there's a way forward that serves both of our interests in ways neither of us had considered when the evening began." The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, and both of them understood that whatever happened next would change the trajectory of their lives in ways that couldn't be predicted or controlled. Daniel stared at her with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that didn't seem to fit any recognizable pattern, while Veronica felt the unfamiliar sensation of having offered something genuine without knowing what she might receive in return. Outside, the storm had passed completely, leaving behind the kind of crystalline clarity that follows atmospheric upheaval. Inside the Crestmont Hotel, 2 people from different worlds sat across from each other at a table that had become the site of the most honest conversation either had experienced in years, balanced on the edge of a decision that would test everything they believed about power, purpose, and the possibility of creating something better than what existed before. The restaurant around them had fallen completely silent, the staff having completed their closing duties while remaining carefully distant from a conversation they sensed was too important to interrupt. Henri watched from the kitchen doorway with the expression of someone witnessing history in the making, though he couldn't have articulated exactly what kind of history it might be. At table 7, Veronica Steele and Daniel Hayes faced each other across coffee cups and the remnants of what had been intended as a simple dinner service, each waiting for the other to take the next step into territory that neither fully understood, but both somehow knew would transform them in ways that couldn't be undone. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire vibrating with possibilities neither dared to voice first. Daniel's hands remained steady on his coffee cup, but Veronica could see the careful calculation behind his eyes as he processed the implications of her unexpected offer. She recognized the expression. It was the same measured consideration she'd seen in boardrooms when seasoned executives found themselves facing opportunities that seemed too substantial to be real. "Ms. Steele," Daniel said finally, his voice carrying the cautious precision of someone navigating a minefield. "I appreciate whatever you're suggesting, but I've learned to be careful about offers that seem to solve problems too easily. In my experience, when something appears too good to be true, it usually is." The response surprised her with its sophistication. Most people in his position would have jumped at any hint of opportunity from someone with her resources. Instead, he was demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking that separated successful leaders from desperate followers. It was exactly the quality she would have looked for in a potential business partner, though she'd never expected to find it in a server working 3 jobs to support his daughter. That's exactly the kind of thinking that convinces me this conversation is worth having, Veronica replied, leaning forward slightly to signal her serious intent. You're right to be cautious. In fact, your skepticism is one of the reasons I'm interested in exploring this further. Too many people hear my name and immediately start calculating what they can get from me. You're the first person in years who's questioned whether what I might offer is worth having. Daniel set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, his movements reflecting the same methodical approach he'd brought to every aspect of the evening's service. What exactly are you proposing? The directness of the question forced Veronica to confront the fact that she was operating without a clear plan for the first time in decades. Everything in her business career had been calculated strategic, designed to achieve specific outcomes with measurable returns on investment. This felt different, more exploratory, more human, more uncertain, in ways that both terrified and exhilarated her. I'm proposing, she said slowly, working through the idea as she spoke, that we find a way to test your theories about sustainable business practices in the real world. Not as an academic exercise, but as a genuine business venture that could demonstrate whether ethical approaches can compete effectively against traditional models. A partnership, Daniel asked, his tone carefully neutral. A laboratory, Veronica corrected. An opportunity to prove or disprove ideas that could revolutionize how business is conducted. You provide the vision and operational expertise, I provide the capital and market access. We build something together that neither of us could create alone. The proposition hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Daniel found himself studying this woman who had spent the evening systematically destroying every assumption he'd held about wealthy, powerful people. She wasn't offering charity or condescension. She was suggesting something far more complex and potentially transformative, a genuine collaboration between equals working toward shared goals. And what would this laboratory look like? He asked, his voice betraying the first hint of genuine interest rather than polite caution. Veronica felt a familiar excitement building in her chest, the same intellectual rush she experienced when analyzing complex acquisition targets or developing strategies for entering new markets. But this felt cleaner, somehow less predatory, and more creative than her usual business dealings. We start with something manageable, she said, her strategic mind beginning to engage with the puzzle of translating idealistic principles into practical operations. A business large enough to test your theories meaningfully, but small enough that we can maintain direct involvement in every significant decision. Something in a community that would benefit from the kind of sustainable development you've described. What kind of business? Daniel pressed his questions, becoming more specific as he began to take the possibility seriously. That depends on what opportunities we identify, Veronica replied. It could be manufacturing, could be services, could be retail. The specific industry matters less than finding something that allows us to implement stakeholder-centered decision-making in a competitive environment. The goal is to create a real-world test case that demonstrates whether your approach can generate sustainable competitive advantages. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful as he considered not just the opportunity, but the enormous risks it represented. Ms. Steele, you realize that what you're describing could fail spectacularly. If sustainable business practices can't compete effectively, you could lose substantial amounts of money. And if they can compete but we execute poorly, the failure could be attributed to incompetence rather than flawed theory. I'm aware of the risks, Veronica said, though she appreciated his honesty about potential negative outcomes. But I'm also aware of the potential rewards. If we can demonstrate that ethical business practices create genuine competitive advantages, we'll have developed a model that could transform entire industries. The intellectual property value alone could be enormous, not to mention the market advantages of being first to perfect sustainable business systems. And if it fails? Veronica smiled, and for the first time that evening, the expression carried some of the predatory confidence that had made her famous in business circles. Then we'll have learned valuable lessons about the limitations of idealistic approaches to business strategy. Either outcome advances our understanding of how value is actually created in competitive markets. The clinical analysis of potential failure struck Daniel as both reassuring and slightly unsettling. She was approaching their conversation with the same strategic rigor she would bring to any business decision, which suggested she was serious about the proposal rather than simply indulging in philanthropic impulses. But it also reminded him that she was still Veronica Steele, a woman who had built her empire by calculating risks and rewards with ruthless precision. "There's something else we need to discuss," Daniel said carefully. "My daughter. Any decision I make has to consider what's best for Emma. I can't put her stability at risk for opportunities that might not work out, no matter how promising they seem." "Of course," Veronica replied, though she realized she'd been thinking about Daniel as an individual rather than as a father with responsibilities that transcended his own ambitions. "What would Emma need for you to feel comfortable taking this kind of risk?" The question revealed a level of consideration for his personal circumstances that Daniel hadn't expected from someone with Veronica's reputation. He found himself reassessing her motivations yet again, trying to understand whether her apparent concern for his daughter's welfare was genuine or simply good negotiating strategy. "Security," he said finally. "Emma needs to know that her home, her school, her basic needs are protected, regardless of how business ventures work out. She's already experienced enough instability for one childhood. I won't subject her to more uncertainty unless there are safeguards in place." "What kind of safeguards?" Daniel took a deep breath, recognizing that he was about to test the boundaries of Veronica's genuine interest in their potential partnership. "A trust fund that ensures her education is fully funded through college regardless of what happens with any business we might start. A guaranteed income stream that covers our basic living expenses for at least 5 years, so she doesn't have to worry about whether Daddy can pay the rent. Health insurance that actually covers her needs instead of the bare minimum catastrophic coverage I can afford now." The specificity of his requirements impressed Veronica with their practicality. He wasn't asking for luxury or excess, just the kind of basic security that most middle-class families took for granted. The fact that these modest protections seemed significant to him reminded her of how precarious his current situation actually was. "Those seem like reasonable requirements," she said. "Establishing that kind of security framework would be a simple matter of setting up the appropriate financial instruments. Emma's future would be protected before we took any business risks that might affect your current income." "You'd do that?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying a mixture of hope and disbelief. "You'd essentially guarantee my daughter's financial security before knowing whether our business partnership would succeed." "Daniel," Veronica said quietly, "the amount of money we're discussing for Emma's security is less than I spend on wine in a typical month. For you, it represents life-changing security. For me, it's a rounding error on my quarterly investment income. The asymmetry is so extreme that the financial risk to me is essentially non-existent, while the peace of mind it provides, you could be the difference between success and failure for our venture." The casual mention of her wine budget being equivalent to his daughter's entire future financial security should have been insulting, but Daniel found himself focusing instead on the underlying logic of her argument. She was right that the financial scales were so dramatically different that what seemed impossible to him was trivial to her. More importantly, she seemed to understand that his effectiveness as a business partner would depend on his ability to focus completely on their shared goals rather than worrying about immediate survival. "Why?" he asked suddenly. "Why are you willing to make this kind of investment in someone you met 3 hours ago? What do you see in this conversation that justifies taking such risks?" Veronica was quiet for a long moment, considering not just how to answer, but whether she fully understood her own motivations. The honest response was that she wasn't entirely sure why this conversation had affected her so profoundly. Why this particular man had managed to penetrate defenses she'd spent decades building, why the possibility of creating something genuinely constructive felt more exciting than any acquisition she'd contemplated in years. "I think," she said finally, "that I've spent so many years focused on extracting value from existing systems that I'd forgotten what it felt like to imagine creating new value. Tonight, listening to your ideas about sustainable business practices, I remembered why I originally went into business. Before the hostile takeovers and corporate warfare, I wanted to build things that mattered. I wanted to create companies that made the world better, rather than just making me richer." The admission surprised them both with its vulnerability. Veronica rarely allowed herself to acknowledge that her current business practices might be disconnected from her original motivations, much less admit such doubts to someone she'd just met. But something about Daniel's genuine idealism had awakened possibilities she'd buried under years of cynical pragmatism. "And you think working together could help you reconnect with those original motivations?" Daniel asked. "I think," Veronica replied carefully, "that you represent something I'd convinced myself didn't exist in business anymore. You have sophisticated ideas about strategy and operations, but you've maintained ethical principles that most people abandon as soon as they become inconvenient. You face real financial pressure, but you've never compromised your dignity or your values to escape it. You're exactly the kind of person I'd want as a business partner if I were starting over and trying to build something meaningful rather than just profitable." The compliment was genuine, but Daniel heard the underlying questions it raised about Veronica's own values and the choices that had led her to become the kind of person who inspired fear rather than respect in everyone around her. He found himself wondering what had happened to transform someone who claimed to have originally wanted to make the world better into someone known for destroying companies and crushing competitors. "What changed?" he asked quietly. "How did someone who wanted to build meaningful companies become known for hostile takeovers and corporate warfare?" The question struck Veronica like a physical blow, forcing her to confront aspects of her own history that she'd spent years avoiding. She could have deflected with a joke about naive youth, or market realities could have dismissed the inquiry as too personal for their business discussion. Instead, she found herself wanting to answer honestly, perhaps because Daniel had shared so much of his own story throughout the evening. "Betrayal," she said finally. "Early in my career, I tried to build exactly the kind of company we've been discussing tonight. Stakeholder-centered decision-making, sustainable practices, long-term thinking. I put together a team of people who claimed to share those values, raised capital from investors who said they supported ethical business practices, built relationships with suppliers and customers based on mutual benefit rather than maximum extraction. What happened? The team stole my ideas and started a competing company with backing from investors who decided my approach was too slow and uncertain. The suppliers switched to competitors who offered better short-term deals. The customers moved to cheaper alternatives as soon as they became available. Within 18 months, everything I'd built was gone, and the people I'd trusted were using my own strategies to compete against me." The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Daniel began to understand how someone with idealistic intentions could become hardened by experience. So you decided that if business was going to be ruthless, you'd be more ruthless than anyone else. I decided that ethical approaches only work when everyone agrees to follow them, Veronica replied, her voice taking on some of the steel that had made her famous. In a competitive environment where others are willing to lie, cheat, and steal, maintaining ethical standards becomes a form of unilateral disarmament. You handicap yourself while your competitors use every advantage available to them. But that's exactly why sustainable approaches need to be demonstrated in practice, Daniel said, his voice carrying conviction despite the obvious risks of challenging her worldview. The fact that you failed once doesn't prove that ethical business practices can't work. It might just prove that you hadn't figured out how to make them work in competitive environments. The suggestion that her failure might have been due to execution rather than fundamental flaws in ethical approaches should have offended her, but instead, Veronica found herself intrigued by the possibility that her cynicism might be based on incomplete information rather than universal truths about business competition. "You think my approach was flawed rather than my principles?" she asked. "I think maybe both were incomplete," Daniel replied diplomatically. "Ethical principles without competitive strategy can be naive and vulnerable. But competitive strategy without ethical principles can become self-defeating over longer time horizons. What if the solution isn't choosing between them, but figuring out how to integrate them more effectively?" The synthesis he was suggesting represented exactly the kind of intellectual challenge that Veronica found most compelling. Instead of seeing ethics and competitiveness as opposing forces, he was proposing that they could be combined in ways that created advantages unavailable to businesses that relied on either approach exclusively. "And you believe that integration is possible?" she asked. "I believe it's necessary," Daniel replied. "The business environment is changing in ways that make purely extractive approaches less sustainable over time. Consumer consciousness, employee expectations, community resistance, environmental constraints. All of these trends favor businesses that can create genuine value for stakeholders rather than just transferring wealth to shareholders. The question isn't whether ethical approaches will become competitive, but whether traditional businesses will adapt quickly enough to remain relevant." The analysis was sophisticated and forward-thinking, exactly the kind of strategic insight that Veronica would have paid consultants enormous fees to provide. Coming from someone whose practical experience included working 3 jobs to support his daughter, it carried additional weight because it was grounded in real-world understanding rather than theoretical speculation. "So our laboratory would be testing whether it's possible to be both ethical and competitive in today's market environment," she said, working through the implications of what they were discussing. "More than that," Daniel corrected. "We'd be testing whether ethical approaches can create competitive advantages that traditional businesses can't replicate. If we're right, we wouldn't just be proving that good guys can finish first, we'd be developing business models that make it harder for bad guys to compete effectively." The vision was ambitious beyond anything Veronica had contemplated when the conversation began, but it aligned perfectly with her lifelong attraction to challenges that seemed impossible until someone figured out how to make them inevitable. This was the kind of transformative opportunity that had originally drawn her to business, the chance to prove that conventional wisdom was incomplete and that better approaches were waiting to be discovered. "The scale of what you're describing would require significant capital investment." She observed her mind already beginning to calculate the resources that would be needed to test these theories meaningfully. "Probably," Daniel agreed. "But it would also require something more valuable than money, the willingness to make decisions based on long-term value creation rather than short-term profit maximization. That's not something capital can buy. It has to come from genuine commitment to different priorities." And you believe I can make that commitment? Veronica asked, genuinely curious about his assessment of her capacity for the kind of fundamental change they were discussing. Daniel studied her face carefully before responding, and she could see him weighing his words with the same precision he'd brought to their entire conversation. I think you've already started making it, he said finally. Tonight, you've listened to ideas that challenge everything you've built your career on. You've considered possibilities that most people in your position would dismiss as naive idealism. You've offered to invest in concepts that can't be reduced to simple return on investment calculations. That suggests you're already changing in ways you might not fully recognize yet. The observation struck Veronica as uncomfortably perceptive. She had been operating outside her normal patterns all evening, engaging with ideas and possibilities that her usual self would have rejected immediately. Something about this conversation, about Daniel's combination of idealism and pragmatism, had awakened aspects of her personality that she'd thought were permanently buried under decades of competitive hardening. Change is easier to contemplate than to implement, she said, voicing doubts she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. I've spent 20 years becoming very good at a particular way of doing business. Starting over with different principles and different goals would require giving up advantages I've worked very hard to develop. Or it could require applying those advantages in service of different goals, Daniel suggested. Your strategic thinking, your market knowledge, your access to capital and networks. None of those capabilities are inherently tied to extractive business practices. They could be even more powerful when applied to sustainable value creation. The reframing was elegant and persuasive, suggesting that the skills that had made her successful could be assets rather than obstacles in developing ethical business approaches. Instead of abandoning her competitive advantages, she could redirect them toward goals that aligned with her original motivations for entering business. You make it sound simple, Veronica said, though her tone carried more hope than skepticism. Simple, maybe, Daniel replied with a slight smile. Easy, definitely not. Changing fundamental approaches to anything requires sustained effort and willingness to make mistakes while learning new ways of operating. But the alternative is continuing to do things that no longer feel meaningful even when they're profitable. The choice he was presenting was starker than Veronica had expected. Continue with business practices that had made her wealthy but increasingly empty, or risk everything on the possibility that better approaches existed and could be developed through collaboration with someone whose values had survived circumstances that would have broken most people's idealism. As she contemplated the decision, Veronica realized that the conversation had evolved far beyond a simple business proposition. Daniel wasn't just offering her an opportunity to test ethical business practices. He was offering her a chance to rediscover who she might have become if her early idealism had been supported rather than betrayed, if her desire to build meaningful companies had been nurtured rather than crushed by competitive pressure. The clock on the restaurant wall showed that it was well past midnight, but neither of them seemed aware of the time. They sat across from each other at a table that had become the site of the most consequential conversation either had experienced in years, balanced on the edge of a decision that would reshape both of their futures in ways that couldn't be predicted or controlled. The weight of possibility hung between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and Veronica found herself staring into Daniel's steady brown eyes, while making a calculation that had nothing to do with profit margins or quarterly projections. For the first time in decades, she was contemplating a decision based not on strategic advantage, but on the simple question of what kind of person she wanted to be when she looked in the mirror each morning. Daniel, she said finally, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that had closed billion-dollar deals. I want to make you an offer. Not a business proposition, We'll get to that, but something more fundamental. Something that addresses the security you need for Emma before we discuss any risks we might take together. Daniel's posture shifted slightly, and she could see him preparing for disappointment, even as hope flickered in his expression. She recognized the defensive mechanism of someone who had learned not to trust good fortune until it proved itself real and lasting. "Tomorrow morning," Veronica continued, "I'm going to have my attorneys establish a trust fund that will ensure Emma's education is fully funded through graduate school if she chooses to pursue it. The fund will also provide a monthly stipend that covers your basic living expenses, rent, utilities, food, health care for the next 10 years, regardless of any business ventures we might pursue together." The silence that followed was so complete that Veronica could hear the distant sound of late-night traffic beyond the restaurant's windows. Daniel stared at her with the expression of someone trying to process information that didn't fit any category of experience he'd previously encountered. "Ms. Steele," he said slowly, that would change everything for us. But I have to ask, what do you expect in return? What kind of obligation would that create?" The question revealed exactly the kind of thoughtful caution that had convinced Veronica she was making the right choice. Instead of being overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was offering, Daniel was analyzing the implications and potential costs with the same careful consideration he'd brought to every aspect of their conversation. "The only obligation," she replied, "would be your willingness to work with me on developing the kind of business we've been discussing tonight. Not as an employee, not as someone who owes me a debt, but as an equal partner in building something neither of us could create alone. The security I'm offering isn't payment for future services, it's removing the barriers that would prevent you from taking the risks necessary to pursue meaningful work." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup as he contemplated not just the offer, but the transformation it would represent in his life and Emma's future. "You're essentially offering to eliminate the financial pressure that's defined my existence for the past 5 years. I'm offering to eliminate the barriers between you and the work you were meant to do," Veronica corrected. "You have ideas and capabilities that could revolutionize how business is conducted, but you've been trapped in survival mode instead of development mode. This simply levels the playing field, so you can focus on creation rather than desperation." The reframing was elegant, but Daniel found himself grappling with emotions far more complex than simple gratitude. The offer represented everything he'd dreamed of for Emma's future, but it also challenged his sense of independence and self-sufficiency in ways that were difficult to navigate. "I've been taking care of Emma on my own since she was 3, he said carefully. "Being her provider, her protector, the person responsible for her security, that's been central to how I understand myself as her father. What you're offering would change that fundamental dynamic." Veronica studied his face, recognizing the internal conflict between practical necessity and emotional identity that her offer had created. "You'd still be her father, still be the person who makes the important decisions about her life and future. The only difference would be that those decisions could be based on what's best for her development rather than what you can afford this month." "It's not that simple," Daniel replied, though his tone carried more thoughtfulness than rejection. "Part of what I've been trying to teach Emma is that security comes from character and effort, not from external sources that might disappear. If she grows up thinking that problems are solved by wealthy benefactors rather than personal responsibility, I'm not sure I'll have prepared her well for the realities she'll face as an adult." The concern was sophisticated and revealed depths of parental wisdom that impressed Veronica with their long-term thinking. Most people in Daniel's situation would have accepted her offer immediately, but he was considering the psychological and developmental implications for his daughter with the same careful analysis he'd applied to business strategy. "What if," Veronica said slowly, working through the problem as she spoke, "we structure it differently instead of a gift or charity? What if the security comes from your work? We formalize our partnership immediately with you as an equal partner in whatever venture we develop. The trust fund and living stipend become part of your compensation package, not charity, but payment for the intellectual property and strategic thinking you're contributing to our collaboration." The solution was elegant, preserving Daniel's dignity and sense of self-sufficiency while still providing the security Emma needed. More importantly, it established their relationship as a genuine partnership from the beginning, rather than a benefactor-dependent dynamic that could become problematic over time. "You'd consider me an equal partner?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying surprise at the concept of someone with his background being treated as an equal by someone with Veronica's resources. "Daniel," Veronica said firmly, "you've demonstrated more sophisticated strategic thinking in one evening than most of my business associates show in months of meetings. Your ideas about sustainable business practices could reshape entire industries if they're implemented correctly. Your ability to maintain ethical principles under pressure suggests leadership capabilities that are far rarer than technical skills or market knowledge. Why wouldn't I consider you an equal partner?" The assessment was generous but accurate, and Daniel found himself beginning to believe that Veronica saw genuine value in what he brought to their potential collaboration, rather than simply feeling philanthropic toward his circumstances. "Assuming I accept your offer," he said, his tone shifting toward practical planning, "what would our first step be? How do we begin testing these theories about sustainable business practices in the real world?" Veronica felt a surge of excitement as she realized that Daniel was moving from considering her offer to planning their implementation. The shift represented not just acceptance of their partnership, but engagement with the intellectual challenge of translating idealistic principles into competitive business strategies. "We start by identifying an opportunity that meets several criteria," she replied, her strategic mind engaging fully with the puzzle. "It needs to be large enough to test stakeholder-centered decision-making meaningfully, but small enough that we can maintain direct involvement in operations. It should be in an industry where sustainable practices could create genuine competitive advantages rather than just feeling good about our choices. And ideally, it would be located in a community that would benefit significantly from the kind of economic development we're planning." "Do you have something specific in mind?" Daniel asked. "Actually, I do," Veronica said, her voice taking on the energy of someone who had just connected several previously unrelated pieces of information. "There's a manufacturing company in Ohio that I was planning to acquire and liquidate as part of a larger consolidation strategy, Midwest Metalworks. They produce specialized components for agricultural equipment and renewable energy systems. The company is profitable but not growing fast enough to satisfy their current investors' expectations." Daniel leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued by the possibility of applying their theoretical framework to a real business situation. "What makes it a good candidate for our purposes?" "Several factors," Veronica replied, her excitement building as she outlined the strategic opportunity. "First, it's in an industry where quality and reliability matter more than just price competition, which creates space for the kind of value-added approaches we've been discussing. Second, it's located in a community that's been economically distressed, since the automotive plant closures, so sustainable development could have significant positive impact. Third, the current workforce is highly skilled but underutilized, which means we could implement employee development programs that would enhance both individual capabilities and company competitiveness. And the current owners are willing to sell. They're actually desperate to sell, Veronica said with a slight smile that carried echoes of her reputation for identifying vulnerable acquisition targets. The company has been struggling to access capital for equipment upgrades and market expansion. The owners are nearing retirement and don't have succession plans in place. They'd prefer to sell to someone who would maintain operations and preserve jobs, but they've been considering offers from consolidation companies that would likely shut down the facility and move production offshore. The opportunity was exactly the kind of real-world laboratory that could test whether sustainable business practices could compete effectively against traditional extraction-based approaches. Daniel found himself mentally cataloging the possibilities for implementing stakeholder-centered decision-making in a manufacturing environment where results could be measured objectively rather than theoretically. "What's the timeline?" he asked. "The current owners have given me 60 days to make a final decision," Veronica replied. "Originally, I was planning to acquire the company, liquidate the equipment, sell the real estate, and transfer the profitable contracts to lower-cost production facilities. Standard consolidation strategy that would generate immediate returns but eliminate about 200 jobs in a community that can't afford to lose them. And now I'm thinking we acquire the company as partners and use it to demonstrate that sustainable business practices can revitalize struggling operations while strengthening communities and generating superior long-term returns for all stakeholders." Veronica paused, considering the magnitude of what she was proposing. It would be the most significant test case for ethical business practices in recent history, with enough visibility to influence how other companies approach similar situations. The scope of what they were contemplating began to sink in for both of them. This wasn't just about proving theoretical points or feeling better about their business practices. They were talking about taking responsibility for the livelihoods of 200 families, the economic future of an entire community, and the development of business models that could serve as templates for sustainable development across multiple industries. "That's a significant responsibility." Daniel observed his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the human consequences of business decisions. "It is," Veronica agreed. "But it's also the kind of responsibility that makes business meaningful rather than just profitable. If we succeed, we create a model that other companies can follow. If we fail, we at least fail while trying to build something better rather than just extracting value from existing systems." Daniel was quiet for a moment, contemplating not just the business opportunity, but the personal transformation it would represent for both of them. "Ms. Steele, can I ask you something personal? Please call me Veronica. And yes, you can ask. What does success look like for you in this venture? I understand what it would mean for me and Emma, and I think I understand what it could mean for the community in Ohio. But what would make this worthwhile for someone who already has more wealth and power than most people could imagine?" The question forced Veronica to confront motivations she'd been avoiding examining too closely throughout their conversation. The honest answer was that she wasn't entirely sure what success would look like, because the goals they were discussing were so different from anything she'd pursued in her business career. "I think," she said slowly, "success would mean going to sleep each night, knowing that the work I did that day made the world slightly better rather than just making me richer. It would mean building something that I could be proud of for reasons that have nothing to do with profit margins or market dominance. It would mean proving to myself that the idealistic young woman who originally went into business to make a positive difference hasn't been completely buried under 20 years of competitive cynicism." The vulnerability in her response surprised them both, and Daniel found himself seeing Veronica not as the feared corporate predator he'd heard about, but as someone who had lost her way and was hoping to find a path back to her original values. And if we fail? He asked gently. If we fail trying to build something meaningful, that's still more honorable than succeeding at things that don't matter, Veronica replied. I've spent enough years winning at games I don't respect. I'd rather risk losing at something I believe in. The simple declaration carried more weight than any business plan or strategic analysis, and Daniel realized that he was sitting across from someone who was prepared to stake her reputation and resources on the possibility that better approaches to business could be developed and implemented successfully. Veronica, he said, using her first name for the first time. I'd be honored to work with you on this. Not just because of what it would mean for Emma and me, though. I'm deeply grateful for that security. But because I think you're right that business can be conducted more ethically without sacrificing competitiveness. And I think together we might be able to prove it in ways that inspire other people to try similar approaches. The acceptance felt like a threshold being crossed, and both of them understood that their lives had just changed in ways that couldn't be reversed or undone. They were committing not just to a business partnership, but to a shared belief that the principles they'd discussed could be translated into practices that created genuine value for all stakeholders. So we're really going to do this, Veronica said, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and trepidation. We're going to acquire a struggling manufacturing company and attempt to turn it into a demonstration project for sustainable business practices. We're going to try, Daniel corrected with a smile that transformed his serious features. And we're going to approach it with the same combination of idealism and pragmatism that brought us to this decision. We'll measure our success not just in financial returns, but in community development, employee satisfaction, environmental impact, and the creation of business models that other companies can adapt for their own operations. As they shook hands across the table, Veronica felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement about work that aligned with her values, rather than just her strategic interests. Daniel felt the weight of financial pressure lifting from his shoulders for the first time since Emma was born, replaced by the energizing challenge of meaningful work that could make a difference in the world. Henri, who had been watching from the kitchen doorway throughout their extended conversation, approached their table with the expression of someone who had witnessed something significant without fully understanding its implications. I hate to interrupt, he said diplomatically, but we do need to complete our closing procedures. However, I wanted to say that in 30 years in hospitality, I've never seen a more remarkable evening of service and conversation. Whatever has developed between you tonight, it's been an honor to provide the setting for it. Daniel stood and extended his hand to Henri with genuine warmth. Thank you for trusting me with Ms. Steele's table tonight. It's been transformative. The pleasure was entirely mine, Henri replied, shaking Daniel's hand with the respect usually reserved for honored guests rather than temporary staff. I have a feeling this evening will be remembered as the beginning of something significant. As they prepared to leave, Veronica turned to Daniel with a question that had been forming throughout their conversation. Would you like to meet Emma before we begin working together? I think it's important that I understand what motivates my business partner, and from everything you've said, she's the most important factor in your decision-making process. The offer surprised Daniel with its thoughtfulness. Most business associates would have treated his daughter as a private matter separate from their professional relationship. That Veronica wanted to understand Emma's role in his life suggested a level of personal investment in their partnership that went beyond strategic considerations. She'd like that, Daniel said, his voice carrying the warmth that always emerged when he talked about his daughter. She's actually quite curious about business and economics. She might have some interesting questions for you about sustainable development and community investment. I look forward to meeting her, Veronica replied and realized she genuinely meant it. Perhaps we could arrange dinner this weekend, somewhere Emma would enjoy, where we can discuss our plans, in an environment that feels comfortable for your family. The suggestion of including Emma in their business discussions revealed a level of respect for Daniel's priorities that impressed him with its authenticity. Veronica wasn't just tolerating his role as a father, she was embracing it as an integral part of their partnership. As they walked toward the restaurant's entrance, Daniel found himself reflecting on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred over the course of a single evening. He'd arrived at work expecting to serve dinner and earn enough in tips to contribute toward Emma's field trip. Instead, he was leaving as an equal partner in a business venture that could revolutionize sustainable development while securing his daughter's future in ways he'd never dared to imagine. Veronica was experiencing her own transformation as she contemplated returning to her penthouse apartment. For years, she'd ended business dinners with the satisfaction of having gained strategic advantages over competitors or potential acquisitions. Tonight, she was leaving with something far more valuable, a partnership that could restore meaning to work that had become increasingly hollow despite its profitability. Outside the Crestmont Hotel, the storm had passed completely, leaving behind air that felt washed clean and full of possibilities. The city stretched out before them under a canopy of stars that had been hidden by clouds earlier in the evening, and both of them felt as though they were seeing familiar surroundings with new eyes. "Veronica," Daniel said, as they stood on the sidewalk where the evening had begun. "I want you to know that whatever happens with our business venture tonight has already changed how I think about what's possible. You've reminded me that there are people in positions of power who still care about using that power responsibly. And you've reminded me," Veronica replied, "that idealism doesn't have to be naive, that ethical principles can be sophisticated and strategically sound. You've shown me that the person I was before I became hardened by competitive pressure is still accessible if I'm willing to take the risks necessary to reconnect with her." As Daniel's taxi arrived to take him home to Emma, they shook hands once more with the formality of a business agreement and the warmth of a genuine friendship. Both understood that they were embarking on something that would test their capabilities, challenge their assumptions, and potentially transform not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone whose futures would be affected by the company they planned to acquire and rebuild. 6 months later, Midwest Metalworks had become the most closely watched business transformation in recent industrial history. Under Daniel and Veronica's partnership, the company had not only survived, but thrived, implementing stakeholder-centered decision-making that resulted in improved product quality, increased employee satisfaction, stronger community relationships, and financial performance that exceeded industry benchmarks. Emma had indeed met Veronica, and their dinner conversation had evolved into a lasting friendship built around shared curiosity about how business could be conducted more ethically. Emma's science project about ocean currents had expanded into a broader study of sustainable systems, inspired partly by her father's work and partly by Veronica's commitment to environmental responsibility in manufacturing operations. The success of their partnership had attracted attention from business schools, policymakers, and other companies interested in adapting their model for different industries and communities. Daniel had completed his degree through an executive program that allowed him to continue his operational responsibilities while developing the theoretical framework for sustainable business practices. Veronica had discovered that building companies created more lasting satisfaction than acquiring them, and that ethical leadership generated respect in ways that fear-based authority never could. But perhaps most importantly, both had learned that transformation was possible at any stage of life if people were willing to examine their assumptions, challenge their comfort zones, and commit to values that transcended immediate self-interest. Their partnership had proved that business could be a force for positive change, rather than just wealth extraction, and that success measured by stakeholder benefit was not only possible, but potentially more sustainable than traditional profit maximization strategies. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Daniel and Veronica returned to the Crestmont Hotel for dinner this time, as celebrated business partners rather than a struggling server and a demanding customer. Henri seated them at table 7, where their transformation had begun, and raised a toast to the evening that had changed not just their lives, but their understanding of what business partnerships could accomplish when built on mutual respect, shared values, and commitment to creating value for everyone affected by their decisions. The woman who had once been known for destroying companies and crushing competitors had become a champion of sustainable development and ethical leadership. The single father who had worked 3 jobs to afford his daughter's field trip had become a respected voice in discussions about stakeholder capitalism and community investment. Together, they had proved that respect was indeed more powerful than fear, that dignity was more valuable than dominance, and that sometimes the most important business transformations begin not in boardrooms or strategic planning sessions, but in moments of genuine human connection between people willing to see beyond their assumptions about what was possible. In the end, Veronica Steele had met her match not in another ruthless competitor, but in someone whose quiet strength had helped her rediscover her own capacity for building rather than destroying, for creating value rather than just extracting it, for leading through inspiration rather than intimidation. And Daniel Hayes had found not just financial security for his daughter's future, but professional fulfillment that aligned with his deepest values, and a partnership that proved idealism and pragmatism could work together to create business models worthy of the communities they served. Their story became legend in business circles, not because it was extraordinary in its complexity, but because it demonstrated that extraordinary transformations were possible when people had the courage to treat each other with dignity, to listen with genuine curiosity, and to believe that better approaches to creating value were always waiting to be discovered by those willing to do the patient work of building something meaningful rather than just profitable. The single evening that had begun with a storm and a difficult customer had evolved into a partnership that would influence business practices for generations, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with the simplest decision to treat another human being with the respect they deserve, regardless of the differences in their circumstances or the assumptions that might otherwise keep them apart.